Okay, I think it's fitting that we are celebrating Buchi Emecheta's work and life in this room, the Brunei Gallery. I recall in July 2000, we were here with Buchi to launch the Ken Prize and organized a symposium between SOAS and the Institute of English Studies. I was representing the MA in International and National Literatures at the Institute of English Studies, of which I was director. And my colleagues from SOAS, Dr. Kwadwo Sainyame Jr., and also Professor Nana Wilson-Tago, organized from the SOAS side. That was the first symposium for the Ken Prize. And our keynote speakers were Buchi Emecheta and Ben Okri. And she was speaking on my right at that very podium there. So it's quite emotional for me that we're actually here. And I was chairing the panel of the shortlisted writers, which included the first Ken Prize winner, Laila Ablela, who I understand is here or joining us later. So it's wonderful, and I think the libation at the beginning talked about presences. So it's just so wonderful that the podium there on my right actually was the podium that Buchi in July 2000 was speaking, encouraging younger writers and talking about her own writing career, and also helping launch this new prize that would bring into the world new writers. So I'm delighted to be here and quite moved that we're meeting here. But my job is to chair and not to speak today, so, which is quite difficult for a teacher. You tend to want to talk more. And so I'm chairing this wonderful panel, and we'll just follow the order on the program. And we'll start with Sylvester Onwodi. And we know he's Buchi Emecheta's son, but I've checked here on his little bio here. He's also, in his own right, quite a distinguished person. He is a psychotherapist and also a medical anthropologist, as well as a publisher and also director of the Buchi Emecheta Foundation. So I'm delighted that he's going to talk about storytelling and the Buchi Emecheta. Thank you very much. Each speaker will speak for about 12 minutes. Yeah.
Hi. Yes. Hello. Thank you. It's quite moving to hear that my mother was actually here on this stage. That's quite an astonishing thought. Wow. But what I wanted to talk about was the fact that my mother was a storyteller, and that storytelling was central to who she was as a person. And I think I'll begin with a small reading from Head Above Water, just a couple of pages, where she talks about storytelling and how she was actually initiated into the art of storytelling. Because, as we said, she came from Ibuza. She was born in Lagos, but Ibuza was this exotic place where she knew that her family came from. And in holidays, when she was very, very small, she would go to the village. And in the village, there was one woman particularly, one of her aunts, who was a great storyteller, who belonged to that oral tradition of just telling stories to children in a very impromptu way. And Buchi really loved that. And she found that this woman, even though she was an oral storyteller, was actually the role model that she used later on as a writer. So later, many years later, she'll talk about this woman who she called her big mother, as the person who inspired her to become a novelist. So I'll just describe this scene where she talks about a trip to Ibuza. The chapter's called What They Told Me, and it's from Head Above Water. She said, most of the events that happened before I was born had to be told to me by my mothers. The history of the British Empire and her greatness I learned from my English teachers at school in Lagos. But when it came to events that happened nearer home, concerning my ancestors, and me in particular, I had to rely on the different versions told me by my mothers. They never ceased to fascinate me, especially as each member of my family had a slightly different version. It was from this oral source that I learnt from many angles the story of my birth. My father, right from the time I could remember, had always called me Nem, which means my mother. And my mother had always referred to my moodiness and the mysterious habit I had of refusing food in order to attract attention as coming not from my side of the family, but from that mysterious woman who gave her father birth. I grew up under the shadow of this, but it was my big mother, my father's elder sister, Nwaka Walazulu, probably pronouncing this wrong, so one of this woman who I see constantly when I look at my image in the mirror. This soft, very fat woman who seemed to have all the patience in the world. This mysterious woman who had the art of punctuating her stories with long silences and deep breathing. It was she who had the patience to tell it all to me in one go. And she describes a scene in which the storyteller is telling a story, and Buchi, as a very little child, is in the audience listening. And then suddenly she realizes that the story is being told about her. So, to use an intellectual term, she's actually been interpolated into the story. And that sense of actually finding a reality for herself through a story was something I think stayed with her for a long time. And I think my mother, even though she used the written word rather than the oral tradition, she was very much in that tradition of telling stories in a very African style. She told about her life. She told about experiences that she knew. A lot of her works are autobiographical. For example, even the African stories that she wrote later, they're about her grandparents or her great-great-grandparents. They're always about experiences that she could relate to. But I had one really strong experience of this storytelling tradition, because as children living in London, Cockney kids in Cambridge Town, who knew about Nigeria only by hearsay, we hadn't actually been there at that point. She would tell us stories about the village. She would tell us about forests and how things used to be, about our grandparents. So this place called Ibuza was coming almost like a magical thing that stayed with us. And even though we thought of ourselves as English and British, we also thought that we were from Ibuza. It was something which was actually quite important to us. It wasn't until many years later that I went back and actually was able to put flesh to the bone to see what Ibuza really meant. And this thing about becoming an anthropologist was actually part of that journey for me. It was going back to actually discover my own history, my own ancestry. So even though I went there as an anthropologist, I actually went there as someone going back to find my roots in Africa, in Ibuza. But yeah, as children, she would tell us stories about the village. And it was quite strange that a lot of the stories that she told us, which we considered to be very personal, later on I realized were actually written in books, and so everybody else knew about them. I mentioned the fact that some of the stories I actually was in there as a character. So it was a bit disconcerting for a while to actually be a character in somebody else's fiction. But I think it's also this thing that she had, the experience that she had in this passage that I read, where she was saying that she felt interpolated into reality by someone telling a story. And I felt something like that as well when I sort of read myself in her books. And it's like a story has no particular beginning and no end. And now I'm part of the story. So in a sense, what I'm doing is retelling my side of the story about Buchi, and passing on her message to me and to you. So I think storytelling is for her about transmission, about communication, but they're also about a way of preserving. And Buchi had this thing about preserving what she valued, and she valued those traditions. Even though in some of her work she was quite critical of them. She was actually, she's very, very much a staunch Nigerian woman. Later on, there was this controversy about her being a feminist or not a feminist, or what kind of feminist she was. But I think her feminism, and she was a feminist because of just the very nature of what she did and what she achieved. It was very much rooted in her traditions of being an African woman. And so when she came to those kind of intellectual Western concepts, it was always from the perspective of an African woman telling her own tale through the medium of whatever mechanism she had. So I think the fact that she wrote in English, for example, that she went to quite a high, important kind of public school in Nigeria, because she won a scholarship to go there. And she was living among kind of the daughters of the very famous and the well-to-do in Nigeria. So even though she was a poor girl, she actually got this kind of leap socially. But all those things that she learned, the language, because English, for example, was not her first language, it was not her second language, it was her third language. I always felt she used the language simply as a medium It was just something instrumental for her. And what she really was this core, was a storyteller. And there's also a legend in the family, which she told, that she actually came from a tradition of song praise singers for the kings of Ibuza, which goes back generations and generations. So I think, yes, this thing about the storyteller is quite central to who I think Buchi was, and it's one thing I want to actually kind of emphasize today. And so we have testimony of this in her books. And just have a small plug, if you don't mind. We're actually relaunching her books under Omenala Press, and this is Head Above Water, the one I mentioned earlier. I think they're beautifully designed, as you can see. And we actually have the artist who designed them, Victor A. Kemenor, here in the audience. And I think they really do justice to her work, and it's also a new way of rebranding her and actually giving her a new lease of life. So with that, I think I'll pass on to the next speaker. So thank you very much. Just to say that the books are on sale in the foyer outside, and for everyone here, there's a 15% reduction, so... Okay.
Yeah, even with that additional comment, he's actually on time, so wonderful, well done. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Alistair Niven, LVO OBA, who will not be a stranger to most of us. Alistair was Director General at the Africa Center for a number of years, from 1978 up to 1994. And you remember the time of the Ngogis, and the Africa Center was quite lively. Since then, he's done other things. He's been literature director for the Arts Council, literature director for the British Council, which is quite unusual to be director for literature for both organizations. But he's had deep and strong connections with Africa. He's one of the few Westerners actually to have studied in Africa. He studied in Ghana and taught there as well. And then came here, taught at the University of Stirling, Leeds, among others, but also on the continent, and has published quite extensively on both African and Caribbean writing, as well as on English literature generally. And he's also been involved with the Gen of Commonwealth Literature, which again will be familiar. So without further ado, I would like to invite Alistair to talk about his connection to Buchi Emecheta. Welcome, Alistair.
Well, thank you so much, Mepelive, for introducing me generously like that. But it's a jolly hard act to follow. Sylvester, member of the family, carrier of the legacy of Buchi, and then the three of us having to pick up that baton and make some use of it this morning without the same family connections. But what I can recall, and I think Margaret and Carol will be able to do as well, are contacts and friendship with Buchi that's in a way survived over the years and still survives. I have a strong feeling that Buchi is with us in this room today. When Sylvester's invitation came to speak, it was several months ago. It was a very well-organized day, and I must have instantly wreathed my face in smiles, because my wife looked across the breakfast table and said, "What on earth happened? That you know, I don't think she's used to me smiling at breakfast." And I said, "Well, I've actually been asked to speak at a tribute conference to Buchi Emecheta." And she said, "Wow, that's great." And I did take it as a very considerable privilege and honor to be asked today. I have only affectionate memories of Buchi, but they're not sentimental ones. She could be a tough lady. I remember that, and quite rightly, she was always concerned that, if possible, she should be paid for anything she did. Now, back in the 1980s, it wasn't automatic that if someone... Actually, we're not being paid today, are we? Absolutely outrageous. But Buchi, you know, she'd had a grinding life of, let's be honest about it, poverty at times, and therefore to ask for money was not just a practical necessity, but it was also a statement of position. If I'm good enough to be asked to speak on a platform, I ought to be paid, and I admired her for that. I am exactly the same age as Buchi. I would not be presumptuous enough to call her my twin, but she did on more than one occasion call me her twin. And I remember thinking, I love that. You know, it's really nice that she can speak so warmly. But, as I say, she was a tough lady. I think it's quite remarkable that 30 or more years ago, consider what's happening at the moment about the gender disparities in this country of pay, of position, of status in company boardrooms and so on, how women still, 2018, are having to struggle for equality and recognition. To find Buchi on the Home Office's Committee for Race and Equality, set up in the early 1980s, on the Council of the Africa Centre, on the Arts Council of Great Britain, as it was then called, main committee, etc., etc., to be part of these public institutions was, I think, extraordinary tribute to how she was recognized to be a formidable voice. I don't think we can really over-egg that, because it was really unusual for a woman of any colour to be on these boards and committees and to make a contribution to the evolving nature of our society. She'd struggled for education, she'd struggled for basic rights like housing, very reminded of Buchi in the recent Grenfell Tower conflagration, because if you read In the Ditch, and I have a copy of it in front of me, or Ada's story, you are reading much of it, the lives of people 30 years later who inhabited the Grenfell Tower. So there were public roles, but in the Africa Centre, I always knew that I could call upon her for occasions when she would contribute so wonderfully. The Africa Centre then, I'm going back 30 years, a very different beast from what it is now. It was a centre in Covent Garden which put on talks and lectures, art exhibitions, social events, music evenings, etc., every day of the year, including Sunday and Christmas Day. It was virtually never closed. It was an extraordinary place for people interested in Africa, caring about Africa or from Africa, to come together and share. It was not always an easy place to be in because, of course, there could be tensions and political differences and so on. But it was a place of diversity and animation and energy, and I was so proud to be part of that. But Buchi would come in at the drop of a hat, and she would do things for us. And what I particularly want to highlight is what Sylvester's really already talked about, was the storytelling sessions. We would, in the daytime, sometimes invite school parties in. They could be very young children indeed, sort of 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Sometimes they would be young teenagers. And she would tell them stories, and I can still see how entranced the kids were by her ability to convey, exactly as Sylvester has said, the stories about her own people. But sometimes they'd be stories about London life as well. They weren't all based in traditional storytelling. And this was simply wonderful. So her ability to interconnect with schools was something that I very much valued. I wanted to end by just reflecting for a moment on her qualities as a writer. She wrote a lot of novels, and she wrote really basically 2 autobiographies. She was always trying something new in her writing. I don't think she was a writer who ever quite repeated herself. If you read In the Ditch, The Joys of Motherhood, Gwendolyn, you read 3 entirely different kinds of book, and yet they are from the same author. what she did is quite astonishing. And I can best express it, not in my own words, but through a Nigerian critic called Catherine Achelonu. These are words written 30 years ago about Buchi, but they would apply today. So I want to end my little presentation with Catherine's words. Buchi Emecheta, perhaps more than any other female writer, must go into history as the most widely read African female writer. With the emergence of her highly sociological novel, The Joys of Motherhood, Emecheta was able to capture for all times the attention of readers and scholars of African literature and to direct these to the plight of African women. Buchi Emecheta has a reputation for making her readers uncomfortable. Her presentation of the enslavement and deprivation of the African woman of her native Ibusa community, coming during the United Nations Decade of the Woman, and coming at a time when women were looking more constructively at their lives through the ages, soon made Emecheta's novels the lexicon for male domination of women in Africa in the eyes of the Western world. That is his historic placing of Buchi Emecheta, and though it was written 30 years ago, I don't think anything has changed. Her reputation is as Catherine Achelonu expresses it there, and I just remain proud to have had a peripheral involvement with her life and work, and today be celebrating it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for that wonderful presentation. My next speaker is Margaret Busby, OBE, FRCL, Fellow of the Royal Society for Literature, but also she has a traditional title of Nana Akwan from the Cape Coast in Ghana, and a distinguished publisher for whom we had a special celebration at Goldsmiths, one of the London colleges, a few months ago, just before Christmas, to celebrate 50th anniversary in publishing. For most of us, she sort of embodies Allison and Busby, the distinguished publishers who brought to us books by many distinguished African and Caribbean, as well as English and international authors. So Sarah James, for instance, the great Marxist critic and writer as well, was published by Margaret here and her colleagues at Allison and Busby. George Lamming, the Belgian writer, in the Castle of My Skin, his book, The Pleasures of Exile, again, was published. It's a very important book, was published by Margaret here. But she's, of course, probably better known for most of us for Daughters of Africa, which I understand is being relaunched. So without going into further details, please welcome Margaret Busby.
It's wonderful to be here, and I've had to write down a few notes because first of all, to try and keep to timing, but because my mind tends to go blank when I'm sort of feeling quite emotional. And you referred to the wonderful tribute at Goldsmiths in December, and I'm glad to see in the audience Dr. Deirdre Osborne, who co-convenes the MA for Black British Writing, and she was the one who organised that tribute. I could talk about Alistair and how I first met Alistair and was on the board of the management committee of the Africa Centre and all sorts of things. And I talk about first meeting you, coming to the flats in London. But I'll just stick to what I've written, because I just want to give you a little context about how I came to publish Buchi and how I came to publishing in a way. But I'll try and sum it up and not get too emotional. When I compare the timeline of Buchi's life with my own, I'm struck by how untypical we both were as young West African women in that era, when our paths first crossed. How starkly different our lives were from one another, and yet how fortuitous and somehow inevitable it all now seems. Around the time Buchi was getting married in Nigeria, I was leaving boarding school in England, aged 15, and returning home to Ghana, where I was born. Not long after she left Nigeria in 1962 with her first 2 children to join her husband in London, I was becoming a 17-year-old undergraduate at Bedford College in London. By the time I graduated 3 years later, I had both met the jazz musician who would become my husband and Clive Allison, who would become my business partner. And our publishing company, Allison and Busby, was conceived before we sat our finals at our respective universities. By the time Buchi's 5th child was born in 1966, I had had my first article published in the New Statesman, where I was offered a column, an offer I didn't take up, since my priority had become to be a publisher. And sometimes I wonder how different the paths would have been had I said, okay, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to write a column. Anyway, that was in 1966, and Nana went to somewhere in the audience, because she was at the New Statesman until quite recently, and she was important. So while the fledgling Allison and Busby was finding its feet, I got married to my musician husband and took a paying job with the Cresset Press, Sparrow and Jenkins, while Clive Allison similarly found employ. I think he was a Macmillan Panther. It was in the early 1970s that I happened upon Buchi's writing, which was outdoored in a feisty column in the New Statesman. Before long, I was privileged to become her book publisher. After the publication of her first book, In the Ditch by Barry and Jenkins, where I had my first experience as an editor, I resolved to make as widely heard as possible this courageous voice of a fellow young African woman that spoke out about standing up to the challenges of gender, class, and race in a way no one I'd ever read before was doing. Title by title, we developed a tight working relationship. I reciprocated her trust in my editorial judgment by doing whatever was necessary, from retyping manuscripts to producing the cover artwork myself, in order to communicate her words and stories to the world. Buchi's journey from orphan child to marital oppression, single motherhood, and societal prejudice to fulfillment as an internationally acclaimed author, although often described as in terms of rags to riches tale, is better characterized as one woman's dogged pursuit and realization of a seemingly impossible dream. As I've noted elsewhere, the dedications of her key books, the books I published, among them were In the Ditch, Second Class Citizen, Other Story, which was a combination of those two, The Bride Price, The Slave Girl, The Joys of Motherhood, Destination Biafra, and children's books In the Ditch and Nowhere to Play. And the dedications, for example, In the Ditch in 1972 was dedicated to the memory of my father, Jeremy Wabudike Emecheta, railwayman and 14th Army soldier in Burma. Second Class Citizen, 1974, referenced my dear children's Florence, Sylvester, Jake, Christy, and Alice, without whose sweet background noises this book would not have been written. The Bride Price, 1976, Buchi said, was for my mother, Alice Ogbanji Emecheta, with The Slave Girl, 1977, which won the New Statesman's Jock Campbell Award. It's interesting how the New Statesman features comes up quite a lot. I felt very touched when she insisted on the dedication being to Margaret Busby for her believing in me. The Joys of Motherhood, 1980, was dedicated to all mothers, while she prefaced Destination Biafra, 1982, the first female perspective on the Nigerian Civil War, with I dedicate this work to the memory of many relatives and friends who died in the war, especially my 8-year-old niece, Buchi Emecheta, who died of starvation, and her 4-year-old sister, Ndidi Emecheta, who died 2 days afterwards of the same Biafran disease. There were, of course, many differences to our life experiences and beginnings. Buchi's in Nigeria, mine in Ghana. But for those years we worked together, in which the books that she is perhaps best known appeared, a decade in which we published the equivalent of one book a year, including most of those for which is now quite well remembered. We forged a sisterhood that owed much to both of us being young West African women, each making our non-conformist way in a conventional literary world that haven't seen the likes of either of us. I have to say, I thought, Buchi was older than me, not that much, but I mean, everybody I published was older than me actually, but I looked up to her in terms of being an elder, but I'm really the same vintage as you all.
Margaret's old auntie. She's coming to this.
The last time I saw Buchi, in the unfamiliar setting of a London care home, she was incapacitated by the stroke that cruelly robbed her of independence. Yet her smile and the unquenched light in her eyes were unmistakable reminders of the spirit that made her so remarkable, a spirit that lives on in the memory of her family and friends, as well as through a literary legacy acknowledged by many younger writers, including Chimamanda Adichie, Irenison, you've heard of, and many of those here today, and perpetuating the books. Now, I'd like to, if I may, read something that's it's not by me, but there were a handful of pioneering African women writers, including Flora Nwapa, Efwa Sutherland, and Amata Edu, who were being published in the 60s onwards. And Amata has sent me something that she would like me to read on her behalf. Remembering Buchi Emecheta, 1944 to 2012. 2017. Some of us began missing Buchi from the moment we heard that she had become somewhat incapacitated. Apart from the fact that didn't sound like her, what we found equally disturbing was the unclarity surrounding the nature of that incapacitation. Buchi Emecheta was nothing if not energetic and clear, as in the decision to leave the now much-quoted abusive marriage in which her husband burnt the first draft of her first book. Those of us who heard it firsthand can never forget the absence of any regret or self-pity about all that. Rather, what she shared with us was an eye-twinkling, wickedly witty account that left us equally shocked and in stitches. We mourned Buchi, that she had to leave. We could do with more time to keep on challenging her on issues such as how anyone can claim to work towards the liberation of women but deny being a feminist. Buchi Emecheta was expert at cutting through mush. So, at writers' conferences and other public meetings, some of us came to unconsciously rely on her to deal solidly with the regular and bewildering array of questions and comments from well-meaning but fractious press, academics, students, and the general reading public. While we fumbled for responses to perennially frustrating questions like, which of your books is your favourite? Buchi would be swift with, my books are like my children, I don't have favourites. I taught the Joys of Motherhood in my course on African women's literature, the novel, and with the passing of each academic year, I got to appreciate the book more greatly, with its tongue-in-cheek title and haunting tales of disappointment and heartbreak. But that is not all of why I miss Buchi so much. Though a few years younger than me, Buchi came out seriously as my older sister, scolding me at every opportunity she got for my financial spaciness and my general lack of practical sense. I was desolate at her loss, but I celebrate her with you today. And she ended an email to me last night by saying, I'll find somewhere quiet to sit and be with you all in spirit. I wish you all a very successful event.
Thank you very much. That was getting two in one. We had Margaret as well as Idu. Well, thank you very much for that. And our next speaker, not least, is Professor Carol Boyce Davis, who will be familiar to many of us, certainly to my students, for the classic book, Black Women, Writing and Identity, which was a landmark publication when it was published in the mid-90s, essentially representing the shift from a sort of traditional approach to literature to cultural theory, which was happening in terms of African literature around the 90s, early 90s. And she was certainly one of those pioneers, especially in that book. She has, since then, continued to publish, and of course she has been a distinguished professor at a number of universities, and at the moment she's at Cornell University in the States, professor of Africana Studies and English. She has published in total about 13 books altogether, so you've been quite busy since 1994 when Black Women came out. And her latest book is Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones, which is 2013. But she's also a creative writer. She's written a story, a bilingual children's story in English, and a Trinidadian, is it, what would you, Eastern Creole, called Avan? Is it Anavan, yes. So again, working in the area of translation. And I actually remember she's been president of a number of academic organizations or associations. I remember being in Kansas when she was president of the African Literature Association in America, yes. And it was a wonderful conference. I very occasionally go to those things, but that was one of the few I went to, and I really enjoyed myself. Yes, and you're a great president. Yeah, so well, without further ado, I think you welcome Professor Boyce Davis.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. It's such a pleasure always being in London and meeting the other half of my family, and I say that because for Caribbean migrations, we bifurcated. Some went to the US, some came to England. And even Margaret embodies both, although she describes herself as an African woman. She's also Trinidadian, I believe. So she has both of those identities. But also the pleasure of seeing people who, I'm seeing faces of people I haven't seen for a while. I see Grace Nichols up there and her partner. Hi, Grace. I see Bernadine Evaristo, hi, and Makeda, and so many people I haven't run into for a while. So thank you for Sylvester for reaching out and inviting me. When I got the email from Sylvester, actually not about this, just about reaching out after his mom passed, I sent a statement. I was quite pleased that, sorry, I have a little thing in my throat. I was quite pleased that he did two things, that he began to relaunch a publication series for the books. Thank you for doing that. It's like reclaiming her in a certain kind of way that she would really appreciate. And I agree with you, Alicia. You feel a sense of her presence too. And also for consistently coordinating these activities that keep her, as he indicates, in our memory and alive again. And I thank you for that. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. As an academic, as you know, I have a paper. Carol and Cooper, I have a paper. But I'm talking about Emecheta and African women's rights. And some things I'll have to cut, I'm sure. But I think some people spoke less, so let me get a little
yes.
Okay. Right, so.
That's worthy of Buchi.
Okay, so I'm talking about Emecheta and African women's rights. And interestingly, Sylvester actually summarized what I was going to say in maybe a sentence. And you did too, in a certain way, Margaret. Anyway, for this presentation, I want to begin with a contemporary articulation, which is easily accessible, and that is Chimamanda Adichie's landmark TED Talk, given in London here, which was titled, "We Should All Be Feminists," April 12, 2013. Subsequently published as a booklet in 2017. There she boldly proclaimed why feminism is appropriate to any given society if we want to achieve a certain level of equality between men and women. Claiming her own feminism and asserting that her grandmother was also a feminist in practice, she highlighted the ridiculous conclusions of men and women in her community, some of them educated, that attempt to return her to an acceptance of subordination. For Adichie, we have evolved, but our ideas have not evolved. 40 years ago, Buchi Emecheta published a number of books which challenged some of these same assumptions, but interestingly, Emecheta reported words were, quote, I work towards the liberation of women, but I'm not a feminist, I'm just a woman, unquote. There was quite a bit of debate at the time on this rejection of what then was an exciting political movement. I'm talking about feminist movement. Many indicated that her creative work spoke to feminist issues, even if she did not publicly claim it rhetorically, as each novel addressed then a range of relevant topics: child marriage, life as a single mother, violence against women, the woman's right to economic independence, and above all, to write. Emecheta, we know, had consistently claimed her professional status as a writer. Quote, being a woman writer, I would be deceiving myself if I said I write completely through the eye of a man. There's nothing bad in it, but that does not make me a feminist writer. I hate that name. The tag is from the Western world, like we are called the third world. I work towards the liberation of women, but I'm not a feminist, I'm just a woman, unquote. Those familiar with feminist discourse already have a certain recognition, I know particularly the students, right, of this position. And a number of possibilities and similarities loom. Perhaps Emecheta comes closer to Alice Walker's womanism, one may say, which was developed precisely to have a space for black women to claim a rights discourse without being subject to Western bourgeois understandings of gender. One can also immediately think of all the qualifications that were offered in order to challenge Western monolithic understandings of feminist movement, African feminism being one of these. Or the example of Audre Lorde, who claimed all of her political and personal identities. And for me, the theoretical position of Sylvia Wynter in Beyond Miranda's Meanings, which offered a challenge to the absence of the experience of black women in dominant discourse, as in understandings of the primary feminist positions, concluding then that gender is but one of the ways that black people are subordinated under Western definitions of what she calls bourgeois man. We conclude then that challenging these assumptions that women experience oppression in the same way or had access to power in a unilineal way, all provided counter-versions, revisions, new combinations, expansions rather than limitations. In other words, I'm arguing that her saying I'm not a feminist is not limiting, but it's opening the door in a different way. Still, it may be useful to delineate a series of these lines of feminist inquiry. Since then, an entire body of scholarship of social science and humanities on African women took up the critique often levied at feminism as a Western import by situating itself within the particular ethnic cultural paradigms and with a focus on gender systems. One can relevantly think, for example, of Ifeoma Madiume's Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in an African Society, 1987, where she used her particular Igbo community to demonstrate that different gender power dynamics operated, which allowed women, if they accessed economic privilege, to have some of the rights which were assumed for men, thus recognizing again, even within the society, that some women's economic activities are an essential basis of their power, but also challenging that Western gender systems are the most advanced. And I think this is one of the important contributions of Ife's work to this discussion. But let us keep in mind, though, for comparison, that at the same time, and I'm glad Amma is here too, another writer in that same cohort as Emecheta was Amata Ayedu, who consistently identifies as a feminist then, and positioned herself differently, particularly in that essay that is often a lovely piece to add to teaching and Sisterhood is Global. There she offered one of the first available sociological articulations of some of the realities of African women in the early post-colonial period. In that short self-reflective essay, To Be a Woman, she followed the statistical information on the Republic of Ghana itself as it relates to the condition of women in key areas like marriage, policy, divorce, rape, sexual harassment, and so on, and also using her own experience. Particularly striking, she would assert that she came of age with a recognition that it was taken for granted that a woman fulfilled a catalog of service roles, but stressed that this condition was, quote, no less ridiculous than anywhere else. And I'm glad you made the point about what's going on in Britain today. From there, she went on to enumerate the challenges of being a writer when social expectations instead demanded your domestic service. One of her conclusions then is that, quote, the criteria for judging human accomplishments, if they are exclusively masculine, renders women outside of the prevailing definitions of what constitutes a full and functioning human being. I want to assert still that Emecheta's version, articulated creatively, marriage and motherhood could mean a willful enslavement to cultural norms. And in one of her last interviews, she asserts, this is Emecheta, that women are capable of living for so many other reasons than men. This is an interview in The Voice, July 9th, 1996. So let us factor in Emecheta's clarification in the famous Feminism with a Small F paper. So after that early statement, she wrote a piece on this, in which which was presented in 1986 at a conference in Stockholm, Sweden, where she provided an important revision. Quote, "Being a woman, an African-born, I see things through an African woman's eyes. I chronicle the little happenings in the lives of the African women I know. I did not know that by doing so I was going to be called a feminist. But if I'm now a feminist, I'm an African feminist with a small f." Significantly, she defines herself then as an African feminist. Nigerian poet Neo Shundari refers to Buchi then as an unintended feminist. Sahara reporters, this is after she died in a statement. For Shundari, this is what makes her the African feminist who taught the world other ways of looking at gender from the African perspective. But unintended or not, let us keep in mind that though many writers prefer not to read the critical work, an African feminism had already been defined by Philomena Steady in The Black Woman Cross-Cultural in 1981. 5 minutes, okay. Emecheta, in my view then, would offer an African women's rights position not identical to Western bourgeois feminist articulations, but specific to the African woman's realities she had experienced and which she described. The logic then of the small f, though, has received a great deal of attention later. For one thing, it subordinates the movement or political position to a specific geographical, cultural, or the political interest, or it qualifies or limits it. The same would apply to socialism, for example. And in the sense, the logic of the small f is what then has sustained. I'm thinking that is where we are still today. In thinking through then, as what I see as the move from Emecheta to Adichie, we can also assert then that Emecheta would be one of the first to challenge textually the representation of women. And when a number of us started to do this kind of work, I was trained in African literature at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. And the question of the representation of women was not addressed at all. In fact, it was assumed that women really had no place in the literature until my generation, I think, began to say, well, how are women represented in these texts? And that was the first book we did called Namica, Studies of Women in African Literature. And I have to say it was not easy. We were constantly under attack from a lot of the African men then who thought this was a Western thing and why are we doing that kind of work and so on. So it was not an easy passage. But the question is, writers like Achebe then, who were hailed as the leading representatives of African realities through literature, did not position women in a way that was formidable until you begin to see Emecheta coming, somebody like Emecheta coming along. So I'm going to jump to the conclusion then, because I know of the time. There's a writer I was just Googling and found a couple of notes by a writer named Zainab Quadri, who says in a piece called Mother of African Literature on Feminism, Motherhood and Why Black Women All Over the World Should Unite, she indicates that the title of Mother of African Literature should go to Buchi Emecheta. Why does one say that? Chimamanda Adichie, when she went to London, when she went to India, was interviewed and was told that Achebe was the father of African literature. And this is what Adichie says. Being a sub-Saharan African writer, you're supposed to be like Chinua Achebe, who is called the father of modern African literature. But you probably compared to him because people did not know any other writer from Africa. She said then I always want to know who is the mother of African literature. And also, why does African literature need a mother and a father at all? The point I'm making, though, is that the Emecheta generation did the difficult work in the Joys of Motherhood and subsequent texts, all listed here, challenged the entire premise of the extreme romanticization of African motherhood, which was then a staple in the representation of male writers. So just by the Joys of Motherhood alone, she broke through that whole intense romanticization of African women linked with Earth, Mother Earth, and all those ways in which that was done from the negritude poets and consistently up into the Black aesthetic movement of the 1960s. And of course, her fellow sister writer, Flora Nwapa's Ifru gives another model of the same thing. But for Emecheta, the African feminist position revealed a consciousness of political oppression, of colonialism, Western domination, and societal domination of a sexist nature, but also some of the internal contradictions in African society, as she explores this well in The Slave Girl. Significantly, her location in London offered Emecheta a global vision of African women in the continent and in the African diaspora that is more current with the next generation of writers. In one of her interviews, she says Black women all over the world should re-examine the way that how history has portrayed us. In the end, though, and I'm close to finishing, I've jumped over a few things. In the end, we can say, by way of assessment, that Emecheta has produced an amazing array of writings, children's fiction, novels, autobiographies, all mentioned here. And significantly, what are now fundamental rights in an international law instrument like the African Union's Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa 2005, ratified by 23 countries of this state? These were issues that a writer like Buchi Emecheta, as we have shown, had already challenged. Hers was always an assumption of the full possibilities of African women. Article 6 of the protocol, for example, deals with marriage in 10 items pertaining to women's right in marriage, from property to fair treatment and relations to children. Article 5 discusses the elimination of harmful practices, defining these as all behavior and attitudes or practices which negatively affect the fundamental rights of women and girls, such as their right to life, health, dignity, education, and physical integrity. Article 7 deals with separation, divorce, annulments of marriage. Article 12 on the rights to education and the removal of barriers which discriminate against women in educational settings. Now, my personal recollection of Emecheta is of a kind, deliberate African woman who preferred to stay as a guest in my house rather than a hotel when she came to give a talk at a university in upstate New York where I worked. And at an African literature conference, and you all have to hear this, where she was being attacked for not producing a Chiabi-level writing on the same panel with a speaker launching such an attack, she responded, quote, "I will accept criticism only from critics who have done what I have done, written 5 books and raised 5 children." I should say that when she delivered that statement, she sort of turned sideways. Anyway, this is my enduring memory of Buchi Emecheta, for it offered scholars in my generation the example of not accepting as valuable unfounded criticism lobbied by those themselves struggling to find a credible position in the academic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We actually on time to, so a bit of time. Yes, we run a little bit, but with some people sort of spoken for less by a minute or so. So that was fine. So you've heard the speakers, so it's time for you to ask them questions. And please make the questions very brief, and they should be questions rather than statements. Yes, okay. So we take 4 questions. Yes, the lady there.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the planners of this wonderful organization. My question is to all of the panelists. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, everybody can hear me?
Yes.
I think we heard her when she was speaking on the mic.
Great.
I think you can go ahead. Your voice is loud enough. I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. All right. I'm so happy again for this conference, but my statement is, even Buchi Emecheta says this in countless interviews, that she began writing because of Florence Moffat's novel Eferu, which Chimamanda Adichie put in the African Writers series. Florence Moffat is known as the mother of African women's literature. bride price, and her husband said, "Why are you writing? African women don't write." And she said, "We have Florin Wapa.
Okay,
She writes."
yeah.
So Florin Wapa
Yes,
is the
yes,
mother
sure,
of
yeah.
African women's writing.
Thank you very much. It's a good question. I think we'll take three questions. Yeah. There's another question there. Yes. You don't mind? We're recording this for BBC 3, so if you could probably stand so we can hear you. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, just a quick one. It's just wondering if your mother had any unpublished, maybe short stories or novels, and if she did, are there any plans to publish them?
That's quite an interesting question because when my mother passed away, I started going through her effects, and we discovered there was a massive archive of things that she kept: manuscripts, diaries, documents, all the lecture tours she went on. She kept all the lecture notes. She was very much a preserver, one of those people who kept things. And she's got things going back to the 1950s, letters. Even in the Biafran exhibition, if you go and see it, you'll see that some of the archives there were things which actually Buchi kept. Yes, and there are manuscripts, short stories, plays, poems, children's books. She was just so prolific. What we're going to do with them, I don't know. It's too early to say, but they're just there now, and they're just kind of, we have to sort of take it all in and actually, make some decision at some point. But yeah, definitely there is work to be done in her legacy with regard to these manuscripts, because I think they're quite important. What I also found is actually, and we nearly used it for In the Ditch, was a foreword that she wrote originally for In the Ditch, which for some reason wasn't used, but I think it's actually more appropriate now, today, what she was writing about, than it probably was at the time. So yes, just watch this space, and I think you'll see.
Okay, great. We'll take one more question, then I'll ask the panelists to respond. One more question? Oh, there's a question here, yes.
I'm prompted to say something because you said that this has been recorded by BBC 3.
I'm not sure, actually.
Anyway,
I think I better correct that.
Okay, whichever bit of the BBC. Whichever bit.
Yes.
I'm always quite horrified that the BBC will have... currently, there is something about women, or greatest women, or great women in this country. And I am always horrified, irritated, annoyed. There is never a black woman that is included in this long list who have contributed to this society. And in fact, all they have to do is come to, we can look around and we can see so many women, and there are also women who have not been ordinary women in this society who have made vast contributions. And it is so irritating that they're excluded and remain invisible.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'll just ask the panel to respond. I'll start with Alistair.
I just quickly want to respond to the question about Flora Nwapa. In the Africa Centre of the 1980s, we had all kinds of writers talking about their work and reading from it. And I can recall Bessie Head, Aminata Saufal, Flora Nwapa herself, Adeora Liliolasi, many other writers, some of whose names are not so well remembered as Buchi, coming. And without exception, they were generous to each other and about each other. None of them would have claimed preeminence over anyone else. They saw themselves as foundresses, if you like, founding figures of a new movement in African writing, but surely if storytelling is about anything, it's about the antiquity of the African tradition, reaching far back into the ancestry. So I think it was summed up, really, when Carol quoted Chimamanda saying, why do we need a mother or a father of African literature at all? We are part of a continuing tradition. And I really want to emphasize that generosity of spirit among all African writers of that decade, and particularly among the women towards each other.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I want to second that. I agree completely. But keep in mind that there is now available material. Abin Abusia and others did that amazing Women Writing Africa collection, which takes it all the way back. And then one could even go to Daughters of Africa to get a lot of that lineage. But yes, one can add Nawal El-Sadawi as well to that group. And basically, they will all be that generation. That's my point. Literary formulas, if you were, of this current generation of writers.
Okay, great, thanks.
I don't know how to sum it up, but I'm glad that we've talked about, Alistair and Carol, you both talked about the historical thing about Daughters of Africa, which I actually put together 25 years ago. It was published 25 years ago, which was a historical look at African women writers. And I'm thrilled that I've been commissioned to do New Daughters of Africa, which will be coming when I finish putting it together. And I'm glad to say that there are many writers who have written pieces already who are going to be in it. Irenison, who read earlier, Verna Wilkins. I'll get you, Carol. And Wangui. Yes, so it's going to be continuing that thing of, it's a chain. We're all linked. We all draw from each other. We all celebrate each other. And I'm hoping that is going to continue.
Just in relation to Flora Nwapa, I know that my mother, during the 80s, she formed her own publishing company called Ogugo Afo. And I think she had her inspiration from Flora Nwapa, who also published books on her own. So I remember she was talking about that. And so that gave her the courage to do it, because there was a precedent for doing that. So.
Okay, great. We'll take another 4 questions. Yes, over there.
Can I just finish? I went to Brixton Library and I asked them, do you have any books by Buchi, Emecheta? And she said, no. I said, when's the last time anyone took a book out? Said 1999. So I went to the librarian and he was so ashamed. I said, you better get some books in there. So I think that's going to happen. Then I went to Peckham Library, which is, Peckham, by the way, sort of Southwark, the largest concentration of Africans in the United Kingdom. And by the way, both all librarians were African librarians, and they've never read the book, never anything about her. So I said, do you have a book by Shakespeare? And they said, what do you mean? Of course we got a book by Shakespeare. I said, you've just proved my point.
Thank you. Yes, libraries, yes, the importance of libraries. Yes, the lady here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, panelists. I just want to touch on what this gentleman has said. I got introduced to Buchi Emecheta by reading a book called Naira Pa. And I would never forget when I walked into the library in my grade 5, and in 1982, and because it was published by Pace Setters, I thought it was a new group of publishers, and here was something by a woman, and I picked it up and then began to find out that, of course, because these other books had been done with African writers, it looked as if it's something that was not accessible to us as children. But moving on for that, I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Alisa, for actually buttressing the point that the whole idea of Buchi and her contemporaries was actually to tear apart whether we had mothers or figures, because like you said, in the Head Above Water, for her to have an auntie who introduced, who told stories, means that actually there were mothers coming through. Because when we think about an African setting where tales are told by moonlight, many children didn't go to moonlight. Actually, it was their mothers that brought these tales back. And you sat with your mother, and while you were cooking, those tales were passed on. So mothers have been in the forefront of telling stories. And I think that what she stood for was, can we get opportunities to hear a mother, to hear a woman speak, to hear a woman perform, to hear a woman be equal, because this is what she represents. She can do it. So I'm very glad and I'm very happy that we are in this situation, speaking about somebody who has championed not feminism, but humanism. You know, just being equal, just having the opportunity to write and to raise children. Thank you very much.
Any more questions? Okay, well, I'll turn to the panelists to respond. Any comments?
Well, I don't have very much to add, but I just want to emphasize a point I made in passing. I talked a little bit about Buchi's involvement in committees and public bodies and so on, and how unusual this was in the 70s and 80s into the 90s to be so involved. She could have made an alternative choice, as some people did. She could have said, I'm having no truck with this establishment that runs this country. I want to look in at it from the outside, criticize it, not in any way accommodate myself with it. She was never anything but a critic. The little bit, that little vignette we had of her on a panel responding to another critic alongside her was very typical. That was her toughness. But she chose to realize, this is her view, that by talking to people and helping change opinion from within, you could actually bring about a better society. And personally, I admire that greatly. There are writers who, of colour who've accepted OBEs and honours from the state and so on, who have been criticised by their fellow writers and fellow intellectuals for having done so. Buchi was very much of the opinion that you work with people, not against them. And for that, I thank her and pay tribute to her. She helped change the nature of this society. There is much that is wrong with it still. So many things are not changed from her day, as I tried to say, but she made a massive contribution to an evolving modern Britain and globe. I really think we should acknowledge that.
Thank you very much.
I think for me, she demonstrated, and the dedications that Margaret indicated about background noises of the children. People like me, who at that time were raising children as well and trying to be scholars, and Buchi Emecheta was an amazing example of somebody who actually did that. So she provided a different kind of example as a woman being a scholar and being a writer and being a mother at the same time, which allowed people like me to do the kind of work that I do.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I think even if we put aside the great books Buchi wrote, if you just think of what she had to surmount as a woman from her beginnings to she having to raise her children, educate herself, that's remarkable in itself before you get to the quality of the books. And I would like to go back to your point that she was a publisher as well, as was Flora Wagner, as was Edward Sutherland, as was Alice Walker, as was Verna Wilkins. So she exemplified that possibility of not only saying, I'm a writer, I can't do anything else. She was a publisher. And I know there's a panel on publishing later this afternoon, but I would like people to think about that as a possibility, to think, not to think, well, publishing is something outside there I can't do. Sylvester is a publisher. Yeah. I think we have to commend him for having, in sort of so little time, republished all these books by his mother. So don't forget that publishing is something any of us can do.
Just a very small comment on the guy who talked about the libraries. I think that's still a battle we need to continue to fight to get black authors into kind of public mainstream libraries. And it's good that Jersey's here. Maybe later on she can mention what she's doing to actually promote that as well. She's going to be on the publishing panel later on, so we can talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think that a number of very important points have been raised here in terms of promotion of African writers. I think that is certainly something that we still need to work on. I think of even bookshops occasionally, our Waterstones here. You find that depending on who is the manager, sometimes there used to be a very good African literature section, but it shifted into a black section, it shifted, and so on and so on. So it is, in other words, you have to look at it as not something that is settled, but as something that we have ongoing. We have to keep pushing, but also that relates to the larger debate about decolonization of the curriculum and culture generally. We still also need to teach these writers, those of us who are academics or teachers. That's again very important. And for me, that's what Buchi Emecheta provided me with, texts that I could teach my students at Begbeg. And so I think for that I'm very grateful. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our session. All good things, unfortunately, come to an end. And I want to thank my wonderful panel of speakers. And thank you very much. And also for you as an audience.